Flushing catches, starts away. Okie dokie. It's 1 o'clock. Let's get this started. This is the Detecting Unwanted Location Trackers, Birds of a Feather, aka BOF. Thank you for coming. All right. The session is being recorded, by the way, so it's just kind of an FYI. This early in the week, so you may not have seen this. This is the note well. This covers a lot of things, primarily things like IPR. If you get contributing and you know something, you got to say something. You need to disclose. There's a bunch of other things in there about code of conduct and the like, copyrights and working group processes, etc. If you have any questions, you can ask us or area directors. Some additional things for some meeting tips. Again, to use the meeting tool, there's a link in the agenda. You can get to the on-site meeting tool if you want. If you want to do the full-blown video, you can do that as well. We'll be doing the slides so that the presenters don't have to worry about that. All good. Yeah, please make sure you turn your video off unless you're sharing. Zach, I think we're maybe going to make an exception for you though. Here's the agenda. We got a note taker. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Appreciate that very much. I'm Sean.
I'm Alyssa.
And yes, the plan is at the end for this to be a working group forming BOF. Just last time it wasn't, so this time we are going to go shoot for everything. And this is our agenda. Basically, we're going to review how systems work and the architecture, and Jack's going to lead that. And then we're going to have a lengthy charter discussion that Brent's going to lead. I will let you know that I do have a tab opened up with the charter. So if we are going to edit on the fly, which is, I love nothing more than doing that. You guys can see how badly I type at speed, but we'll do that if we need to. And then at the end, we'll have a bunch of BOF questions where we do our typical hums. So without further ado, the BOF goals.
Yeah, sure. So just drawing from our traditional BOF guidelines, the point of the BOF is to demonstrate that we have community agreement about a few things. The first is that there's a problem that needs solving, and the IETF is the right place to do the solving. That there's a critical mass of participants willing to work on the problem, so we will be asking about this at the end. We had a lot of interest last time, but it's been a few months, so we'll check in again. That the scope of the problem is well defined and understood, and that people generally understand what the working group will work on. We're going to spend, I think, a lot of time talking about that today. There's agreement about specific deliverables, which we'll also talk about, and it's believed that the working group has a reasonable probability of having success. Like, we don't want to charter a working group if we think that we're not actually going to be able to produce the deliverables that we agreed to. So that's what we're trying to get to by the end of today. And Zach is going to be first. Okay, go ahead, Zach.
All right, thank you, Alyssa. We good? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Cool. Morning. By the way, Roman put this together at the end of last meeting, so I just want to say thank you to Roman for putting this together. I think the place that we wanted to start was if we take a look at the overview of the system architecture and talk through, I think particularly what things are in scope and what things are out of scope. One of the more material changes, I think, since the last time we all talked and due to the feedback from everybody was what particular pieces here are actually in scope for the potential solution. So left-hand side is the architecture, right-hand side is a pairing up of that to what is actually in scope. One of the new changes is actually on number one itself, enrolling and tracking network. One of the main updates that we've made is ensuring that the aspect of actually enrolling in the system, and I think in particular, what trackers are doing to validate they're actually correctly implementing the protocol is one of the main new pieces that is in scope now. So I think in particular, the goal here is for trackers that correctly implement the protocol, that they can actively participate in the network, and for those that have not, have some verification that that they haven't, and be able to exclude them from participating in the network altogether. If we shift over to 2, which is in the from the red tracker down to the green box non-owner device, presence broadcasting was in scope, continues to be in scope. I think here the pieces are things like how a tracker advertises, what it advertises, the frequency with which it advertises, all kinds of things like that. Totally fair, totally in scope. 3 is in the bottom left-hand corner, determining unwanted tracking. I think this is probably the main bit that we are calling out of scope at the moment for this particular working group or proposed working group, which is how does a system actually do the determination of when unwanted tracking is happening? I think the goal is to have the signal be all of the pieces in effect that are the rest of the system diagram, but the actual determination not be in scope for this particular working group. The next 2 bits are, I think, particularly about what actions can be performed by a non-owner. The 2 main ones being something like get the tracker identifier, or get the type of device that is potentially tracking, and then take some actions like play a sound on the tracker to try and find it. I think the requirements of what should be in there and how they should work are all totally reasonable here. 6 is actually disabling or getting disablement instructions. Obviously, a critical piece of if you've been tracked on without your knowledge or consent, getting the information, obviously a critical piece here. And 7, a similar set of things, which is how should we actually interface to get information about the owner itself. And so I think in this regard, we've I think historically imagined this to be some redacted set of owner information, not obviously identifying the owner. I think there are lots of privacy and security considerations that will go into what does the appropriate solution look like for kind of 6 and 7. I think the last couple bits, one of the other newer changes was providing some guidance or some physical security considerations, which I think was based on feedback from the last BOF, to figure out how do you particularly identify trackers that have either been modified in some way to make them harder to find, or either, we thought about, the attack vector, like wrapping something in duct tape or something like that. And I think figuring out how we want to identify those trackers and potentially either proactively notify about them or alert the user in some way is, I think, a new addition to the most recent version. And the last couple bits, which are 9 and 10, reporting the location and querying the location, I think go hand in hand with number 1, which is active network participation being gated on some kind of verification mechanism. I don't think we've necessarily scoped particularly what that is. I think that the goal is, with part of this working group, figuring out what attestation looks like in some capacity. I'm going to pause there.
You're ready for questions, Zach?
Yeah, I think we can do questions here if you want to first.
Okay. Go ahead.
This is Daniel Kahn-Gilmore. Thanks for presenting this. I think it's really useful that we think about this entire system, and it is complicated. I just put this in the chat, but the title of this BOF is the one thing that is marked not in scope. I'm worried about that. Can you talk a little bit about why the title of the BOF is the one thing that's not in scope?
Yeah, I think by the way, totally reasonable question. I think the way that we've hoped that this would work is that the actual detection itself is kind of dictated by all of the inputs to these pieces. Like all of the other pieces are the critical aspects of doing the detection itself. But the detection, I would say the detection system itself probably has some platform-specific nuances that I think make it potentially more challenging to dictate exactly how that works on, I suppose, iOS, Android, and any other system that we want to implement it. I think something that's fair to potentially call in scope is some of the basics around like what signals are used as input. But I don't know how to think about kind of threading the needle between kind of fully speccing out every aspect of the manner in which unwanted tracking is occurring and figuring out how to kind of scope in all of the right inputs at the same time.
So, I mean, I don't think we should bring in scope like what color should the alert be in the GUI, right? I mean, I get that. But if we don't actually think about how we are going to detect unwanted tracking with this protocol, then we're missing the boat. And I think that means two things. It means, one, we need to think about when the user is actually going to become aware of this thing and what kind of parameters we should be talking about. And we need to think clearly about the false positives. The false positives are a serious risk for this system, right? If we set this up so that it gives you a warning every time there's an unwanted tracker, success, but it also gives you a warning every time there isn't an unwanted tracker, they will not be useful. So we really do need to think about the name of the working group, which is the one thing that's marked not in scope here. I think it's a mistake to just say, well, we're going to give you all the pieces, put it together yourself.
Can you come back for 1 second? So you would find a lot more value if there was a standardized definition of what it means for the tracker to be unwanted. Because I think what I hear him saying is that it's possible that having a diversity of in that definition could be useful. Like maybe Android thinks of it one way and iOS thinks of it a different way, and like perhaps there's some utility in that. But I think I just want to probe on whether you think there's really only one definition of like what does it mean for the tracker to be unwanted, and we should just standardize it.
There might be a range of those definitions, but if we aren't even willing to tackle what it means, we're just saying, hey, we're giving you some signals and you can figure out yourself how to do that. I'm not convinced that we've solved any problems here, and maybe we've introduced problems. And if the goal of this is detecting unwanted tracking, we should have at least some guidance that says, you know, you have a Bluetooth device that where you've noticed enough of the presence broadcasts that are in detached mode, if this is what we're doing, that you don't recognize because you're keeping a database of devices that you've that you've allowed. We need to think about what the user's experience is going to be. If this protocol is going to work, we need to be able to tell people that here's how you defend yourself from an unwanted tracker. And I don't think that we can leave that up to, I mean, what if I want to make a device that's going to do this detection? What does the device need to do? Like, how can we propose all this stuff and not talk about what that device needs to do?
Okay.
I mean, I don't know that there's one specific standard, but we need to talk about like the range of things that are reasonable to do, right? Like, do you have an allow list for presences that you're willing to remove from, that you're willing to ignore, or do you say it has to be visible for a range of time? And here's what we think the reasonable time ranges are, as aligned with the frequencies that the rotations happen. Or I don't know, but like, how can we not do the thing that we're saying
implementation guidance almost?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, and there's a user experience question here. The goal here is for users to notice that this is happening.
So I actually have two responses to DKG. The first is we change the name of the group, because what's being described here is actually not merely detecting trackers. It is actually designing a tracking network, and then also detecting trackers. So I think that's the first thing I would say is I don't think we should feel confined to calling the group this. But the second, I 100%, but that said, I 100% agree with you that we should be specifying a mechanism. This thing is out of scope, and I actually have a suggestion for what we have to do, which I think is a little more elaborate than you suggested, which is I think we ought to define a set of algorithms, which if you implemented them would do a reasonable job, in our opinion, of detecting unwanted tracking. And we have precedent for this. If you look at what Quick does, for instance, right? Quick comes with a congestion controller, which you do not have to implement. You can put your own congestion controller, but like if you go and you read the Quick documents and you do straightforward implementation of Quick, you can say it's okay. And so I think similarly here, we should build something where if you read these documents and you do the thing it says in this document, you get something that kind of mostly works. And so I think more than guidance, I think we actually provide an algorithm, and then like people are free to innovate, but it would mostly work if you did that. So that I think that those two things are what I would suggest.
Rowan is next.
Hi, Rowan May. So I came up to talk about the false positives. So the first case that I was thinking of is if I'm a thief and I don't want the thing that I just stole to be tracked. And then the second use case is, my kid rides on the bus to school, say, and they're sitting next to somebody else, and they're like, oh yeah, I'm being tracked, and so now the parent no longer has the ability to track the backpack of the kid. Right? So what I'm looking for is something more like a challenge mechanism of like, hey, like how do you prove that if I want to disable a device, how do I prove that this device is following somebody and not just by happenstance happens to be next to this other person. And I didn't see anything like that.
Thanks. Tommy.
Tommy Polyapple. So bouncing off of what DKG and Ecker were saying, yeah, I like Ecker's suggestion there. And what I was originally going to say here is, it feels like this should be in scope, but essentially, even potentially more than just like an example algorithm, and an actual algorithm here with the pieces that you can fill in or extend with local policy and heuristics. And as another example, and this is a totally mundane example, but working on happy eyeballs implementations where we say, okay, we're racing connections and here's this algorithm, but there's all of these different variable values that depending on local policy you could have, or you have these other heuristics or historical information, like maybe one your client OS will say, oh, the user already marked this thing as something that they know about and they don't want to be bothered about again. So yeah, you can have local information, local policy that's going to amend and extend the algorithm, but still have a core baseline to understand how do you approach this problem, and actually spec that out. And I think we have many examples in RFCs of cases where that doesn't overly constrain the client implementations to not add the functionality or UI or other things that they need.
We have Marcin next.
Hello, I'm Marcin Godzina from ISC. I'm wondering, because the two most used cases for tracking devices, one is tracking of things that can be stolen from us, or children that can be kidnapped. And with making things like easy disablement of the devices, easy discovering of the devices, I'm wondering if we're not giving a very easy tool for bad actors to find the devices, because for them, they're unwanted tracker devices. I have no idea how to solve this problem. I'm just trying to put stick into the spokes with this thing.
Zach, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think we had some discussion about this in the last BOF, and I think if I recall correctly, some of that conversation was around, I think in effect, like people taking priority over stolen property. I think I know it's a hard line to draw, and I know it's a weird thing to talk about in some aspects, but I think the protections of ensuring that people are not tracked without their knowledge or consent is probably more important than ensuring that stolen items are not notified. I know that's tricky, but I think if I remember correctly, that was a conversation with Eva last time around.
Go ahead.
Jonathan Hoyland, Cloudflare. I just want to like really strongly second that. Like stuff is much less important than people, and it's not just, oh, you know, children that might be kidnapped. Children also have a right to privacy. Like you can't just be like, oh yes, children, they don't need like children also need privacy.
Go ahead.
I don't think it's probably helpful to drill down into like the relative priorities of like of the equities here. I think it should be clearly the case. I think it's clearly the case that it's like not possible to build a system, or we don't know how to build a system that that allows you to detect when you're being tracked and you don't want it, but doesn't allow people who are storing your stuff to detect that they're being tracked and they don't want it. And so and it's just the same. There's the same technical property. And so you know, I think my impression is that like and I don't usually make this argument, but like that you know, like it or not, for the people who want to detect when their stuff is being stolen, the manufacturers have made a decision that they want to make it possible to detect when you're being tracked. And so there's going to be a system for that no matter what. And so we have a choice of whether it can be a standardized system or non-standardized system, but we do not get to choose whether there's going to be anti unwanted tracking countermeasures in these systems because they're going to get built. And if someone wants to go build a tracking system which does not have those countermeasures, like I did for the protocol police, you can't stop them. And if they want to use it for any theft, I guess that might or might not happen, but like that's not the world we're going to be living in no matter what, as far as I can tell.
Thanks. Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, just also to that point, I agree that there needs to be a mechanism and is going to be a mechanism, but also I think the detection that the broadcast provides actually provides more utility for the person who's being surreptitiously tracked than it adds new capabilities for the person who's stealing a device. In particular, if you're stealing something, you typically know when you stole it. You can physically search it. You're not constantly keeping track of when something may have been put into your bag or something. You know when you take it. So the thief already has capabilities that the person who's being surreptitiously tracked doesn't. So I think it actually provides quite a bit of benefit to work on this system and doesn't provide as much advantage to that attacker, even though I agree that also it's more important to provide that benefit. Thanks.
Thanks. Rowan, go ahead.
Yeah, Rowan may. Just so people have been bundling kind of two things together. One is informing somebody that there is a tracker nearby, and the other is the disablement. And I think that those have very different properties, right? Like the right to be informed that something appears to be tracking you is maybe a more fundamental or more easily achieved, or both, property than being able to work out whether you have a legitimate right to be able to disable somebody else's tracker that may just happen to be maybe happen to be walking along the same route or on the same bus or subway.
Okay, I think this ground is well trod. Are there any remaining questions for Zach? Nope. Okay, Brent, you're up.
Good afternoon and good morning. Let's go to the next slide. Next slide.
Oh.
Is that better? That's better. Cool. So Zach gave an overview of this. I'm going to dig in a little bit further. And hopefully this is going to go by pretty quickly, at least the first part, reminding everyone of the changes we made. So since looking at the email group and looking at the video and notes from the last BOF meeting, we filed about 25 issues on GitHub to track all the feedback. Some of those turned out to be duplicates or related. I think there were upper teens, maybe 20 PRs that we pulled together to address that specific feedback. We made our best attempt to take all the feedback and incorporate it into the charter. I don't think we omitted anything. So hopefully we have a much better charter than we had 3 months ago. So summary, the high-level summary of the changes we made, and then we're going to go through the actual language in the charter as an overview and then get into hopefully real-time editing. So as Zach mentioned, the full BT advertisements in scope, that was feedback from the last time, as is the NOC payload. The privacy and security requirements and considerations for the unwanted tracker, the crowdsourced network, sorry, the finding network are in scope. Non-conformant trackers are in scope. Physical security considerations, as Zach mentioned too, are in scope. Considerations for people without a device capable of detecting unwanted tracking are in scope. Of course, we fixed minor typos and clarifications. And then Apple did submit updated IPRs. There was feedback about the IPR disclosures last BOF meeting being too restrictive. So we submitted those back in October 12th of 2023. So let's go to the next slide, please. So literally just copied and pasted in the charter. What I've done is bold and italic font or anything new. We did not remove any text. We did move some text from the not in scope to the in scope, but nothing has been removed from the charter from 3 months ago and the current charter. So next slide, please. No changes there. Should I pause?
Do you want to get through the whole thing first?
Oh yeah, whichever way you want to do it.
It's up to you.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, so I think I just want to can you back? I just want to level set. So so I sort of made an assertion a few minutes ago that this was the project here was to design the entire system, not just to design a detection mechanism. And I heard some people nodding, so I thought people agreed. But this text here is very much entirely about the thread about of unwanted tracking, right? And so if either people broadly agree with me that the job is to design the entire system, in which case this text should change to actually say the problem of finding your crap when you lose your keys is the problem we're trying to solve, and we also want to solve the stability. Or people disagree, in which case we should fight that out now. But I think I guess my comment would be that this text is not really appropriate for the charter of a working group, which is about helping you find your keys.
Sorry, when you say the entire system, you're including the whole tracker network?
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess my thesis, to step back, my thesis is basically you can't actually plausibly describe any of the system's privacy properties without having a complete design, right? And also I think interoperability is good. And so I thought and I read the work items to be basically describing designing the entire system. And so if that's that's people again, this is why I wanted to have this conversation, is if people think I'm way off base here, then let's talk about that. If people think I'm on base, then we should revise this text.
But sorry, I'm just gonna ask one more question, just for clarification. Yeah. You think this framing text is out of sync with the set of interfaces that were presented in the diagram?
Yes.
Okay.
I think it's
that's
just
the problem.
It's like sort of saying, it's like saying we're going to specify HTTP, but the only thing we specify is cookies. the only thing that the introduction to the charter is cookies, right?
That seems pretty straightforward to fix.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, again, as long as we're on the same page, that's great. I'm happy to provide text, but I just want to make sure. It's a text problem and not a we don't agree we're trying to do problem.
It's a text problem in my view. Yeah. Thank you.
Tommy Polly Apple. So just, I think there's maybe a middle way here, because I think we agree on the scope of the actual work items, but I think it is a key point that, for the purposes of charter, in the background, we should acknowledge such location tracker networks do exist already. So and they have a key gap that we're trying to fill. And so the work we're doing may need to specify kind of the whole system. But I think for the purpose of background, I want to keep at least a bunch of it to really highlight the problem with unwanted trackers, because that is the motivation for doing the work. So maybe some of the framing is different, but I think a lot of the body here should remain, and we should be motivated to do this work, not for the purpose of making tracker networks super flashy and better, but in order to amend this gap in existing systems.
For Kano does, right?
Well, right, but I'm just wondering, would you be okay with, expanding the scope within the background, but still having an emphasis on this is why, this is the motivation, this is our goal here.
Okay, we have some more folks in the queue on this part. Jillian, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi, Jillian Berga. I work for Apple, obviously representing myself today. I do want to say thank you. I appreciate the interest in EKG. I hear your points. I think it's important to remember that some of the companies that make the tracker detection networks, obviously Apple and Google, who are both represented here, competitors with each other. There's other finder networks that are also competitors with Apple and Google. And we're here because we want to solve this problem. And we think it's really important to solve this problem in a way that protects people regardless of what finder network they are using. But at the same time, there are laws that say we should not be sharing every bit of information about our operating system with each other. Each finder network is trying to build a finder network that is the best and can do the best job at finding your keys. And we're not necessarily at liberty to share all of the details about how those finder networks work. We welcome algorithms and suggestions and things like the detector network should have ways of finding a Bluetooth tracker that has been muffled so the speaker doesn't work. Those kind of recommendations are welcome. But to actually go into all of the details of how the finder network is specified is going to be different for each finder network and proprietary. So there's a reason that we're trying to create a little line between kind of everything and what we need in order to protect people from unwanted tracking. Thank you.
Thanks. We're going to close the queue on the first two paragraphs. So if you want to talk about these two, please get in the queue, and we're going to drain the queue and then move on. Nick.
Yes, Nick Doty, Center for Democracy and Technology. I don't think the goal should be specifying a network for finding keys. I think there is importance in having the visibility of those payloads because of the potential privacy implications and to do a comprehensive privacy evaluation of the system. But I think it's less likely to get adoption if we're trying to define a new location tracker network and either like deprecate every existing device or convince all companies to operate a single location tracker network. And I think it's more in line with the goals of what participants in this group have expressed interest in, which is the detecting or like mitigating the harms of unwanted tracking. So I think the scope can include those things in terms of like visibility, but I think it's like less good for adoption if we're trying to develop a whole new location tracker network.
Go ahead.
Hi, Roman Dinelli was AD. One item of feedback I heard in the mic is that there is a particular scope later in the text that may or may not kind of jive here. It might benefit us to get a little bit further down to see what that scope is, and then we can perhaps circle back to say, this is the front matter. Typically, background is background, but the meat that binds us is what happens in subsequent sections of the charter.
Are we allowed to move forward?
Yeah, we got to drain the queue. We have two people in the queue.
So I'm certainly happy to talk about the details, but I mean, the big picture doesn't matter. And like, I guess I would make 2 points. I understand these companies are in competition with each other, but like Mozilla and Chrome were in competition with each other. We should specify quick. So it's like, that's what standards is about, is interoperability and specifications. So I don't see why that means like we can't do a full specification of the wire format. The relevant factor here is it is not possible to do security analysis of the system without having a complete description of what appears in the wire. And that inevitably means building something which is like more or less interoperable, even if you don't, even if you don't in fact interoperate. And we have like certain experience of that, like with SIP, where like there's SIP is nominally interoperable in the wire, but the people don't actually SIP trunk when you want them to. But like, so I guess I don't know what details one thinks one might not disclose, but the wire format hash should be fully described. And maybe you have a special sauce algorithm that detects, that uses those signals to determine when tracking is happening, and that's probably fine to have secret. But like, what actually does have to happen is the wire format has to be described, or the thing will not work. The thing will not do the thing we claim it's going to do, which is allow to do that.
Yeah, there's more details on that coming.
Yes.
Andrew.
I'm not sure this is solvable, but you know, even something as simple as that last sentence in the first paragraph, which sounds perfectly reasonable until you consider, if my mother has dementia and I've got power of attorney, then is it an unwanted tracker even if she doesn't know about it? So I think this would benefit from having clarity of what use case in more detail it's trying to solve. Yeah. And a sort of one sentence, I think, is insufficient. You know, Jonathan mentioned children as another potential sort of challenging area. So I think more work's needed to be really specific on the problem this is trying to solve, because I think we all maybe read different things into what the problem is and whether it should be solved.
Great feedback. It was a healthy discussion about that at the last BOF, and I think when we get to following slides, you'll see that we try to address that. Let's go there. Yeah. So again, bold, italicized, or new. There was a question, so I'll just summarize these quickly. Application, there was a question about which level protocol are we specifying, so try to clarify that. The sentence, this protocol is intended to protect people against unknowingly being tracked. The intent of this working group is to make it easier for arbitrary devices to detect unwanted tracking by these accessories. It was an attempt to focus on the use case. The next sentence, the working group will define privacy and security properties of its solution, including privacy and security protections for tag owners when tags are used appropriately, and evaluate the trade-offs. Those were both based on feedback of making sure we're protecting legitimate use by the tag owner and making sure we're covering all the privacy and security properties of the overall solution so that we know the efficacy of it. Next slide, please. A little bit smaller font here. We called the protocol the DULT protocol, which I think we reused elsewhere. Next one was, there was feedback a couple of times about the opaque blob need to be in scope. So using standard formats for the underlying transports. We're not iterating on that. And then there's a follow-on comment later specifically about the whole advertisement, whether it's Bluetooth or NFC being in scope. Next sentence, including such things as tracker image assets and physical disablement instructions. There was feedback in last BOF that the scope being, which was intended to be beyond Bluetooth detection and Bluetooth message passing, also considers HTTP protocols, that was in scope, just trying to clarify that with the text here. The next sentence, add privacy and security requirements or considerations for all messages used for advertisements, interactions with crowdsourcing networks and owners of accessories, again, pulling in the privacy and security properties of the finding network as being in scope, the opaque blob, and then owners of accessories. And then work item 2, we added the physical security considerations. I think Zach had that as a maybe. I think we can debate if we really want to do that. I think it's a good idea to have in scope, but it does kind of broaden the scope of this working group somewhat. And then the last bulleted sentence there, include considerations for protecting people who don't have a device capable of running a platform-based unwanted tracking detection system. So if you don't have a phone capable of running it, what can we do? How can we best protect you? That's in scope. Next slide, please. Getting to the item 4 was added to get to the point of just making sure whatever solution the working group comes up with, we understand how well it works, holding ourselves accountable. Item 5 was designing mechanisms to ensure that devices do not correctly implement or adhere to the DULT protocol can be detected and excluded from being trackable via the crowdsourced networks. That's the non-conformant feedback that there was a robust discussion in the last BOF and over the email group on that. So that's in scope. And this, of course, considers accessories right now that can't be firmware updated that would like to move to that, but just aren't able to. And then the last one, there was a question. Excuse me. The last sentence, there was a question about what accessories are in scope, or it could be better to define accessories. So the proposal here is things like that have inherent location capabilities and people know they could be used to track already. Things like phones, tablets, watches, and laptops. We're not considering accessories for the for this particular working group. Next slide, and that I think is it. And no changes on the milestones.
We will eventually have to put a date on there, and these are always very aspirational. Do you have any sense for when you think we might first submit a draft to the ISG? No. So, I mean, normally, just for everyone who might not, there might be a lot of new people here. It's 3 years from start to getting an RFC. So it's not out of this world to put 2 years down. And it could, apparently it's true. People told me that, but it's.
If we put 2 and we don't meet that, are we in trouble?
No. The only thing that happens is the chairs get yelled at by the ADs, like, update your dates, update your dates. That's about it.
I like 2 years.
Yeah. There's probably milestones in the data tracker in 2012. Let's be honest. Documents are still underway. Okay. You ready for the queue?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's do it.
Stephen, go ahead.
And when do we want to switch to? Should we listen to feedback and then switch to edit mode? We already have some good edits we want to make from Ecker's comments earlier.
Go ahead.
Hi, Stephen Farrell. So I appreciate that you're adding like security and privacy analysis and so on. However, I think a little bit something slightly different is needed, because I think we need some evidence of efficacy. And we could end up with something that has well-known security properties, well-known privacy properties, but still is useless. So I think what's missing for me for this set of tasks is, I think, 2 things. One is to include the overall efficacy of the system as a thing to analyze. And secondly, in this particular case, I think I would argue that some evidence to back that up based on implementations and trials and so on would, I think, be well worth having as an explicit thing in the charter.
Seems reasonable.
And
how could you imagine those looking?
How could I imagine them looking?
Yeah, where would the evidence, where could you imagine the evidence would come from?
So I guess if people have implemented and deployed trials and people have tried to break them, and people have demonstrated that there's some utility. So again, I'm thinking back to the kind of COVID tracking stuff during the pandemic, where there are serious questions. People have different opinions, but there are serious questions as to whether it was of any utility at all. And I think it's possible that something could be developed here which has well-known security and privacy properties, but turns out not to be useful. I think knowing that before we declare victory would be a very good thing in this case.
Yeah, I agree with you in principle. I think I'm struggling to understand how to measure that before it's implemented. Are you suggesting after?
I'm suggesting that people do implementations and trials and tests before the working group declares victory.
Okay, that's a great idea. Yeah.
Jonathan.
I should note that I shared the link to this document in the chat. So
Jonathan Hoyland, Cloudflare. I want to bring up a point I brought up in the last one, which I was subsequently told was thoroughly unclear. So one thing I think needs to be, in my opinion, in the charter is a specific statement that says client authentication is mandatory, because the client being the tracking device. Because the tag, yeah, because I don't want somebody to be able to say Apple's network is really, really well spread out, really, really good detection. I'm going to invent a device that uses Apple's network, but is not actually an Apple device and is in some way malicious. And so having a mandatory client authentication requirement in the charter, I think is super important, because otherwise we're going to end up in the 256 bits is just impossibly expensive. We can't possibly do that space because manufacturers like saving money.
Nick?
Yeah, I have a question about the coordination part towards the end. I opened an issue just today, so I'm not expecting people have already reviewed it, but I think another important part of coordination, and something that's going to be especially important for the unique type of work that we're doing here, is to have engagement with advocacy groups and service providers for those working with victims of intimate partner violence, victims and survivors of intimate partner violence. I think that might be a little bit new for the IETF. I think it's going to be quite important. I think we should explicitly call it out in the charter, because it will take some proactive engagement. It won't just be, oh, well, anyone can send to the mailing list. I'm not sure that's going to be fully effective. There are going to be people who I either don't have the technical or the sort of protocol level understanding, but have the expertise on threat models and on the potential impacts. That's very important. And there's also going to be some people who are less comfortable participating in a publicly archived forum, and so we may need liaisons or other types of ways to handle that relationship. And I've been glad about the people who have showed up so far. I hope we can do more engagement like that, but I think that's at least as significant to call out as the Bluetooth work for the charter. And to Stephen's question, it might actually help us with that impact question. I also don't know exactly what the quantitative metric would be, but I think it could be extremely valuable to get feedback from people who are providing services on the ground to people who are being tracked, to describe both their sort of use cases and needs up front on the requirement side, and the actual impact it is or isn't having for the harms on the deployment side.
Thanks, Nick.
Yeah.
This is a great idea. Any reason why we couldn't or shouldn't have this?
No, I mean, the only thing is that the formal liaison relationships are typically set up via the IAB, and so that was roping another group in. I'm hoping that the people that are doing this are also engaged with those other groups and can informally do some of that, and then we can formally, when we figure out who that is, we can include those and then work on trying to figure out how we do that specifically. Nick, to the people that won't come to the light and are afraid to talk, I don't know what we're going to do about that, because I'm not really very comfortable with that whole idea that you can whisper in the back room and then somebody comes out and says something like, this is what we all think is a little weird. So we'll have to work on that.
Chris Patton, Cloudflare. What's my question? Oh, point number 5 in this list of points. Oh, the actual deliverables. This is just a clarifying question. I'm not like, I think this is a great thing to include, but how do we expect this to work? Do we know? Do we have ideas? Do you want to share them? I'd love to hear them. Okay, cool. That's it.
Ecker's there's a number of ideas out there. I don't think we have a agreement on the path forward, but there's lots of ideas, and the group definitely wants to work in this space.
Yeah. I mean, it's does the network have to somehow detect if a device is, can't be opted into this protocol, and then just disable it? Is that conceptually the idea?
Disable it or prevent location updates from it, or somehow notify the owner or the company that operates the network. There's a number of ideas that have been floated, and I think some people have some very specific ideas. I think, again, the real point here was the last BOF, and also over the email group, people want to make sure the working group can discuss this and figure out which of the different options are feasible.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, cool, thanks.
So I have a couple of thoughts just as an individual. The first one is on the privacy and security language. So there's now like 2 new places where this is discussed, which is good. But I was just curious about whether it could go a little further, because there's been enough examples where something along these lines was said in a charter, and then it's like the privacy considerations are that we don't consider it, right? So I'm curious if you think it's possible to have a sort of affirmative requirement that like what gets specified here will not be used as additional cannot could not be used as additional tracking vectors based on the information that's exchanged in the various interfaces. This is not how you would put it in the charter, but something along these lines. Like it's more of like an objective goal. Like this is the privacy goal of the working group, is to not create additional vectors for tracking, as opposed to just saying we're going to like document it and explore the trade-offs. Does that seem possible? Okay.
Yeah.
And then my other just note, which could be useful in the new part about phones and tablets. In some of the other IoT groups, I know in the past the charters have specified like the dimensions of the device or the capabilities of the set of devices that are in scope. And usually it's not really the physical size of the device, but the processing power or whatever. It gives like a range. So that's something that you could think about adding here as a more precise way of saying what's in scope versus out of scope, because like inevitably someone will put a device on the market which is somewhere between like a watch and a tag, and then you'll have to say like, is this in scope or not? And it's just easier to say like something that is more descriptive of what the set of devices are that you want to be in scope.
Okay, it's good feedback.
Roman.
Hi, Roman Dinilius, AD. I'm wondering if, Stephen, I can put you back on the spot to come kind of clarify your feedback, because I've heard you say it twice and it seems really important. So how does one demonstrate that evidence? And I know other working groups have a working culture of, we're going to do interop, we're going to do implementation where we feel. I haven't seen that written into charter language though. So can you tell me a little bit about what you mean and kind of what's different beyond like, oh, sorry, there you are. In terms of, are you saying this should be the specification design philosophy, or are you saying we need something hard? Because to me, if we say something hard in the chartering language, and now I'm going to be put in the position of, if this were to be chartered later on, say, well, did we meet the experiment or not? That seems like a very different physics. Maybe I'm not understanding what you mean. Can you say a little more?
I can try. So I mean, again, going back to the experience with the COVID tracker and stuff, right? Which is not 100%. It's definitely not the same, but there's some overlap here, right? And but nonetheless, it was a thing that happened, and it turns out, at least in my opinion, that a whole lot of the claims made for that system were not true. It may have had some impact. It may have had, it may have been better to do something utterly different, like just randomly telling people to go get a test or something. And part of that was when we were able to test the system, it turned out that there was lots of ways in which, it was more or less in picking up the various Bluetooth beacons. It was more or less at random in certain environments, like within trains where you're surrounded by metal. The thing just didn't really work. And so what I'm saying is that if we're talking about a system like this where there's potentially bad downsides, knowing that, having some evidence, and what that evidence is would depend on what we actually develop, but having some evidence that it actually has an impact and reduces the harms before we kind of standardize it, I think is kind of called for.
Just a point of clarification, by standardization, you mean like publish an RFC with a number on it?
Yeah.
So this is kind of like implement, like write the spec, actually get some implementation experience before you say you're done.
Right, but the implementation experience is not only to which I think what's different here is that normally the implementation experience is, does it interop and do people want to actually do it, right? Here it's also, does it really reduce the harms? Which I think is a slightly different thing than we would normally do.
So if I maybe restate this kind of again, in other working groups, when we publish RFCs, we sometimes do interop, sometimes we publish without knowing whether it's actually going to do kind of any good. And I would say that's probably a non-trivial majority, but what you're saying is this work is so safety critical that we can't go to publication without having, and I'm not sure what words to use kind of after that, there's some checkout gate, and we need to define that checkout gate before we can go to RFC, and we got to put that in the charter.
Yeah, I think that's almost. Essentially, we're talking about this is trying to mitigate a harm, as opposed to add a new bell or whistle. So therefore, do we actually succeed in mitigating the harm? Seems like a valid thing. Now, how you actually make tests for that, how you would have the working group reach consensus that we've passed some kind of bar, I think that's fair enough for the working group to figure out. But I think requiring the working group to do that seems like a fundamental part of the problem here, right? As opposed to just trying to make something go faster or get two boxes to talk to each other.
Maggie.
Hi. Yeah, so I just wanted to plus one what Nick had said earlier about involving people who might not be able to directly contribute to the working group or the standards. I've been working with a couple of different tech abuse advocacy organizations, and I think the big feedback that we got when we tried to share the draft of the standard was we have no idea what's going on with this, and we feel really excluded, but we feel like there's an opportunity for them to contribute. So I think it's really great if we can try to find a way to work with these people. I think there's a lot of different ways to do that. And I think basically just makes sense for the working group charter to just say that that's going to happen. And I think a lot of the details can be worked out after the fact. And I'm happy to help with that if I can.
Daniel Gilmore. In the chat, Mallory Nodal points out that we may also want to think about whether this system is actually inhibiting other forms of mitigations for stalking. One of the things I've been concerned about as I think about this is that a common form of stalking today is malware on the user's device. And if this system causes advocates for survivors of stalking to say, well, you need to keep your device on you at all times, and it needs to be on at all times, or you won't be able to detect these trackers, then we are in some sense increasing the value of malware on the user's own device. And I don't know how to navigate that tension. But if I'm talking to someone who's concerned about tracking, one of the things I will say to them is, does your partner have access, or your stalker have access to your device? And often the answer could be yes. And I say, well, you should try leaving your device at home. You should turn it off, when you're going someplace that you're worried about. And then that won't work for this. So if we can't demonstrate efficacy that's the way that Stephen is talking about, and we put this out there anyway, we may have made the problem worse. I don't have a solution there.
Do you think item 2B up there addresses your concern?
Or not to be.
Because we added that since last time.
Yeah, so I think that's
it's
good, but don't have a device is different from, don't want to use a device right now. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I was concerned that that other piece was not considered in scope. Maybe we want a device that just does the detection, right? If we could bring a device to market that just does the detection, but can't run all the malware that everybody's pocket supercomputer can run, then that would be a useful thing. But if we don't talk about what that device needs to do, we may have made the other thing worse.
Few points. I guess first, I'm pretty skeptical of this required proof efficacy thing. I've now heard Stephen say this twice, and I still don't understand what he thinks proof would consist of. So I'm not a big fan of an unfunded mandate here in terms of evidence, whatever. You can ask all you want, but in this, here's some idea of what we should have. And and I think Patton was asking, giving ideas about how to address this problem of fake tags. And I say the same thing to you. If you have no idea what that evidence consists of, then it shouldn't go in the charter, because it's just an unfunded mandate then. I'm much more sensitive to the concern Daniel's raising about are we making the problem worse? I think that does need real consideration. I guess what I would attempt to balance that against is the fact that I know that some of these mechanisms already exist in terms of the tracking systems. I guess what I would say is the status quo ante for that needs to be how do these systems currently behave, rather than some hypothetical system which would be perfect, right? And so we know these systems currently beacon, and we know that the systems, and you know at least the air tags. I don't know. I know more about air tags than anything else. The air tags, when they're when they're in to be found mode, behave differently than not in to be found mode. And so that should be the reference point for we making this dramatically worse than that, not the reference point if we wish things didn't exist at all, which would be a different reference point.
Makes sense.
And I guess since I finally did get up, Chris, yeah, I have some ideas. I think, if you believe in attestation, then the answer is the attestation is somehow tied to the beacon, and so you can prove the beacon the beacon consists of exactly the thing that was signed by the attested device, and that's not perfect, but it gets you some other way there. So.
Nalini?
Nalini Elkins, Inside Products. So to get to the proof of does this work or doesn't it work, or does it like stop harm? I mean, it's like proving a negative. It's like, how do you know you stopped harm? I mean, that gets a little difficult. So I don't know. I mean, maybe it's like, at certain women's shelters, we found X things, because you don't know like what would have happened. So that's kind of the trouble I have with stopping harm, is I'm not sure what that means.
Nick?
Yeah, again, I'm just going to suggest that we talk to experts about the efficacy and about this hypothetical worse harm. I don't think we're in a good position to assess that, and I know that there are like clinics and organizations that are very familiar working with people, talking to them about the trade-offs, seeing the harm that people are experiencing from these tracker devices, not hypothetically. So I just don't think like we need to. I don't think that the charter of an IETF working group is the type of place to try to distill that expertise that's in other networks about the actual harms and trade-offs.
Rowan?
I've been trying to lower my hand in the tool for the last 2
Okay.
minutes.
Okay, no problem. Tommy?
Tommy Polyapple. So 2 things I wanted to bring up. So one, to the efficacy point, I wonder if what we can just put in the charter text, because we already have like something in there about what we should do before we publish it, do the analysis. What if we just put, and there's an intent to get some deployment experience before publishing, and then like we can let the working group evaluate the deployment experience, and like that, I think that should cover it without being overly prescriptive for a charter. Got some thumbs up there, great. To the other point about, that DKG was bringing up, because I think this is very good. You're saying like, what if we had a device that just does detection? Where my mind at least goes on that is that, there are other complementary efforts we need to do in the overall ecosystem that are a little bit orthogonal to this, but I think can help it. And for example, at least, within iOS, because that's what I'm thinking about here, like we have modes like the safety check mode that are dedicated, and lockdown mode. Like they're modes that are meant to be like, hey, I'm trying to get out of an abusive situation, or I'm trying to stop tracking, and it is turning off lots of things that would otherwise be used for tracking. And separately from this effort, we can talk about how effective those are and how we can make that even better and better over time. And I hope we do. And I'm very passionate about making sure that's good. And I think where that intersects with DULT is that we just want to make sure that any such special modes are still able to do the unwanted tracker detection, right? Because then that, like, you can have a phone and hopefully say, yes, go into mostly a brick for people being able to track me, but also be able to do this and maybe able to contact the services I need to get help.
That's a good idea, Tommy.
Can you stay there for 1 second? Do you think that's something for the IETF to do?
I don't. And maybe this is something for a research group or HRPC could take it out, but like, it may be interesting to enumerate all of the different things that you would want to lock down or disable, like the things that our safety check team considered, and be able to write that down. Like, hey, here are all these different vectors. Some of them are networking related. A lot of them aren't. A lot of it's, like what's been installed on your device and all these other things. So I don't it would be a great presentation. Maybe it would be a great thing to even have brought up to the working group as like informational background, or done in HRPC or something like that. But I think for the purposes of this, I don't think there necessarily needs to be a charter change here, but when we're writing the document, we should be aware of these things and give advice to, like, make sure that this thing is on in all of these different situations where you may otherwise be turning off other functionality, because this is important for those.
Thanks.
Mallory Nodal, CDT. So I'll first respond to that because I just want to affirm, I think it's useful to, at least from a user interface perspective, figure out how to make this work best, but I don't know where that happens. And now I'm going to take that hat completely off and speak only as an individual with some experience working in shelters and with survivors. I think these trackers on the market is bad. So I'm somebody who thinks they shouldn't exist and they should not be available for consumer use. However, thank you very strongly about that, but I'm convinced this work is important, and I'm here to try to assure folks that this is a harm reduction approach. Even if you got these off shelves everywhere, there would still be companies that would sell them, there would still be people who bought them, there would still be jurisdictions in which they would be legal. And so I think this is important, and it should be done with as many implementers as possible to come up with the absolute best solution. And at the same time, I think we should work really hard to convince companies or convince regulators that these are too harmful to be in everyone's possession, for all of the reasons that I think folks have said in the past about how solving theft, for example, or helping people find things that they lose a lot isn't as important as keeping people safe.
Roman.
Hi, I feel like I'm just come up to the line to comment on what others have kind of said. So I want to unpack the idea of whether there's more threat. The attack surface is kind of larger because the suggestion is that you have to have your phone with you to do the unwanted tracking. My read of the charter was that the intent of this working, well, I'm reading it, the intent of this working group is to make it easier for arbitrary devices. So this idea, I'm making this up, like I have some small custom board on which has some Bluetooth, I run some Linux, and I implement the algorithm that we are probably going to put in the charter that I could detect these devices without having my phone. So I keep my phone off and I could still kind of build that. So DKG, so does... Right, okay, fair enough. I'm just kind of checking because we said arbitrary device. Thanks.
Stephanie.
Hi, Stephanie Mickelson. I work for UNFPA, United Nations Population Fund. And I do focus on this topic of intimate partner violence, gender-based violence. Globally, we work in 150 countries. We have lots of networks of organizations. And I just wanted to say and kind of represent the community that this is an issue that is of concern. And it is something that we as a community are focusing more on. Last week, I had a conversation with an organization that's literally testing out all of the different tracking devices so that they can learn more about it, how it's working, what the distance is. So there are groups actively working in this intersection. So it would be really wonderful if we could bring them to the table, because I'm sure that they have a lot to say. In particular, when we talk about, I think somebody brought up a good point about how, okay, well, what about if the perpetrator demands that you keep this on you and is active, and if not, that would result in harm. I mean, that goes the same for apps, that goes the same for tablets, for many different things. So to say that it's good or bad to have that is oversimplifying a very complex issue that ultimately needs to be centered on the survivor and a survivor's needs. So understanding it a lot more holistically, joining with the gender-based violence response providers and making sure that whatever we do is actually substantially consistent and involved with that, and is going to be important if we really are looking at victims and survivors of intimate partner violence. The last piece that I wanted to say is on the data piece, and proving a harm that isn't there is always difficult. As a field, it's very difficult. We do have ways of measuring success via social norms and other ways. So again, we're happy to contribute there. I in particular love doing that. So yeah, we can definitely add to that. And I think that was it. So yeah, thank you. And I really appreciate that we have this. So thank you.
Thanks for sharing.
Sam.
Sam Weiler. I heard someone propose an additional requirement of an authentication scheme. I don't want to see that. I think that the task 5 up here is sufficient. And the way I heard the requirement was one of adding device attestation, and I don't want to see us go there. That's the way I heard it. I don't want to see us to go there any more than is strictly necessary.
So not device attestation, client authentication. Those aren't the same thing. Like if I build a, yeah, I have a tag. Yeah, it is a client. Okay, I have a tag.
Device, not
I have a tag that I made myself, and it's a completely I could in theory have a tag that I had made myself and that I wanted to track using my own personal tracking network. And I wouldn't have to implement device attestation. I could just stick a key on there, right? That's how I want to do it. It's dumb, but like I could. I do think the client authentication is really important, because otherwise what's going to happen is someone's going to say, oh, I figured out that if I just send this fixed byte string, I can use Apple's tracking network with no difficulties, and that's bad. Because I might have, we're assuming that maybe Apple is non-malicious.
Yeah. Jonathan, can I ask a quick question? Do you think item 5 here covers your concern? You have a specific, my understanding, you have a specific implementation you're interested in. This was written to allow for many potential implementations. But do you feel good about item 5, or does that wording need to change?
I would say you need to add a specific text that says client authentication is a must, because otherwise this could be interpreted to mean, oh yeah, you just set like a user agent and it can be a public string, and that's totally fine. Like if you don't specify what your actual property is, someone can interpret that property to be stupid. Because people are stupid.
Yeah, let's not call people stupid.
I think 5 is sufficient and we don't need to change it.
Sorry, say that again, Sam?
I think that item 5, as shown, is sufficient and we do not need to change it.
Okay. Dino.
Hi, this is Dino. So I think the charter should have something much stronger to send a very clear message to the vendors. My MacBook shouldn't be tracked. My phone shouldn't be tracked. I just bought some Beats last week, Beats earphones, and I just find while I was sitting here, and they're being tracked. If I buy an AirTag, the sole feature is to track, but all these other devices shouldn't be tracked at all. So I think the IETF or this charter should say, by default, everything that Apple and Google ships should not be tracked. It should be turned off. You know what I tried doing while I was listening to everybody? I tried turning off my watch not to be tracked. By the way, it's saying Find My right now is saying this is 5,000 miles away from me. Okay, so the software is buggy like crazy anyways, so misleading. It's so hard to turn off. I think the IETF should mandate this. And so you say, if the IETF mandates this, what makes the vendors want to listen to them? Well, the vendors have come in here wanting to make things safe. The vendors have to adhere to this mandate. And if they don't, they're not being compliant. They don't care about safety.
No.
There are ways to turn off Find My if it's not working well or could use improvements. I'm happy to have a discussion with you about that. I mean, from your privacy, which I care about a lot, Apple cares about a lot, there should be very easy to turn off the Find My features for the devices you talked about.
So I feel like we've sort of like lost the thread here on 0.5. The question is like, what is going to be necessary in order to achieve this? And I think Ecker is right. I also think Jonathan is right. Something like, okay, so we might argue about what the definition is, but there might be something like identifiable about the tags that is intrinsic to achieving this goal. Is a possibility. I'm not saying it's inevitable. We don't want to make the crypto too fancy if crypto is the solution for this. Anyway, I think we need, this is another +1 to something that Ecker mentioned before. We probably need to know something about what Apple and Google are doing, like how they identify devices, if they identify them. Presumably they do. We should, because like a goal of the charter right now is don't make privacy work, which I think is we can agree on, but I think we're already in a situation where privacy might be worse than we expect right now, and we should clarify that. I don't know if I'm making sense. It's just these things may not be in conflict with one another.
Tommy?
So to the discussion on 0.5, I agree with some of the comments that I'd like to keep it more at this scope rather than saying you should do client authentication. But I wonder, Jonathan, when you explained why you wanted client authentication, which I liked, and I think maybe client authentication or some other spelling thereof is the right thing. Can we define a modification to the sentence that just describes the property that you want out of it? Like, what is the guarantee? And just say what guarantee you want rather than saying the mechanism, because let's debate that in the working group.
Right. So the property I want is authentication of the client. And the client, in this case, is the tag. So if you want to say tag authentication, fine. Like, I don't care if it's certificates. I don't care if it's... The security property I want is that a non-authorized tracker can access a different tracking. A tracker can access a tracking network it is not authorized for.
That's what can we just put that in there? Just like design the back. I mean, I think it's close, but like if we just, I don't know, go back to the recording and write that down. Like that's what I want in there. Not like let's debate in the working group how we instantiate that property, and it may be exactly what you're saying, but that's the job of the working group, not the job of the charter.
Yeah. Okay. So I am totally happy with we define the authentication property that we want, but like, yeah, it needs to be that I can't join a tracking network if the tracking network doesn't know who I am or doesn't want me to join.
Yep. That makes sense.
If we zoom out just a little bit, Jonathan, why don't you want that? You don't want that because you don't want the devices that don't adhere to this to be trackable. So what is here is what you actually want. And you're saying that as long as the tracking networks can eject the things that we don't want, that's good enough. But it's not good enough because they might be confused about that. If we do client authentication and they agree that you can use your key on your random little fob, and then your fob, and this wouldn't be you implementing it, but somebody else might implement it where the key would leak. And now the key could be used on all the other devices which don't actually implement this design. So what we want is this. Whether we can get this, I don't know. But what we want is we want to say the tracking network should refuse a tracker that doesn't implement this. Whether or not it's authorized is not the same thing. This is the goal. What you're offering might be a way that we can get on the way to the goal, but this should be the goal.
I'm different topic. You can continue with the same.
Right. So I mean, I basically got to say what DKG was going to say. The property we are trying to enforce is compliance with the protocol, not exclusion of unauthorized trackers. Now, as has been, I think it was maybe Patton has said to me privately, like, of course, manufacturers actually probably do want to exclude trackers that are authorized, and that's like it's not a goal of ours to stop that from happening. But that's not the point of this part of the exercise, right? So the point is, I think the point. So I think as DKG says, it's like not sufficient because you could make a device. So I mean, let me give you like a concrete example, right? Say you had a client authentication system where the devices signed things, but then there was like a payload that wasn't part of the signature, and that was the part used for tracking, right? And so like what I do is I buy one of those devices and like I capture all its emissions and then I just stuff on the tracking payload in the end that's not covered. So you actually need to have like even if you're doing client authentication, you have to like bind the whole thing together. And while I do suspect that you're correct, that you will in fact have to have a signature over the whole thing in order to make the thing work, that's not the thing. The thing is this thing.
Martin?
I was wondering because we are all agreeing that this is very important for trackers to have, but I see a lot of work for manufacturers of the trackers and not many benefits for them. Are there any ways that we can convince them to implement these things other than legislation and legal requirements?
So I think as Apple and Google are both the proponents of this BOF, we're very motivated to make sure trackers that work on our networks implement this. I think there was express support for this from a number of other companies, including Tile and Samsung, back when there was a press release from Google and Apple on the work we were doing here. So there is support. You're asking for how to go to the next step to further motivate them beyond their support.
There are no protocol police still. So, you know, I think there would be some desire to follow along with the larger companies, and then maybe legislation comes along, but that's not our problem.
Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, I think I was going to just say, I think like having the high level language about designing mechanisms is useful because I really don't think we should over constrain it at this stage. Like it already exists the case that there are sort of customized devices that are tampered with or are designed to like use other mechanisms for tracking. Those are known threats. Those are known threats to the people who provide advice to survivors, and they have other policy mechanisms for trying to address that through markets and legislation and things like that. So we just shouldn't expect to define a complete solution right here.
Thank you. Jillian?
Thanks. I think another important consideration in making companies motivated to adopt this as accessory makers is making it not too difficult for them to actually adopt. So we want to create a specification that works, but not one that specifies a lot of other stuff that is unnecessary for them to change in their Finder network.
Yeah, and I think there's language in the charter acknowledging that already.
Chris?
So I'm pretty well convinced. But this really covers well the case of like legacy devices. But what about devices built after the fact? Like what about I guess Apple and Google are also motivated to not let any old device use their tracking network. So
is your concern?
So someone builds a device that looks like it's participating in this protocol properly, but is not.
So I think that would be covered by 5A or 5. Yeah.
I mean, 5A covers legacy devices specifically.
Yeah, 5 plus 5A.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Oh wow. We drained the queue. Okay. Oh yeah, yes. You can sit down. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, we're gonna take a 90-second pause and then put what we think are the agreed changes up.
typing? Yeah. Wait, I can try to edit. I don't know. Maybe that's. I mean, that would be more than 90 seconds. Yeah.
Yeah. We could have 30 seconds.
I think in addition to one, there was a request for baseline algorithms, or at least baseline algorithm to be specified. That seemed reasonable and a good
With the
idea.
number 1.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, so this is kind of our understanding of the changes that we heard that had support from those who came to the mic.
Can I suggest a one-word change to 5?
Yeah, this is not actual charter text.
Oh,
This
sorry,
is
no,
just
no,
like
no, to 5 in the charter.
5 in the charter.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think I would be happy with the words to cryptographically ensure.
Is that too narrow in scope?
No, cryptographically.
I'm hearing feedback from the group of no. Is the no?
Okay.
Is it no because
with,
that's
with,
too
with probability
specific?
2 to the minus 128? I don't care if it's cryptographic.
Minus 127. I mean, my problem is our job is to ensure it. And if cryptography is the best way to ensure it, we should do that. But if it's not, we should not. So why would you narrow the scope now? Maybe you want strongly? I don't know.
Yeah, because I feel like there is an interpretation where people say ensure just means, we tried. Well, that's what I said with probability 2 to the minus 127.
It sounds like there's vested interest in the hopefully to be formed working group to do a really good job with item 5.
I mean, it's like not like binding arbitration here. I mean, like, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So other reactions to this list, like did we capture everything that people think was discussed? David, go ahead.
David Skenazy speaking as an individual contributor. Just from the discussion earlier, I thought that there was a little bit of confusion between people on item number 1, where I think what Ecker was suggesting is that we specify an example specification of how this determination could be done, whereas I think someone else thought it was, oh, you need to specify how my company does it with all the internal secret sauce, which I don't think is what is said here. So I would suggest using some word like example to make that crystal clear, to make sure everyone's on the same page.
I think Tommy, or baseline's great.
I'll just say in the mic, baseline algorithm.
Maybe in.
So I think 2 things I heard that I think didn't quite get captured here, which as I mentioned, I do think the name needs to change a little bit. Or we're just going to be like quick and be like DULT just as DULT doesn't mean anything. But like it's just too narrow a name otherwise. We can fight that out later.
You're just suggesting we change the name? Is that, I'm just want to
Yeah.
Okay.
Or just don't detect, and then it'd be easier.
Do you have a proposal?
I don't, but I'll think about it. DULT. Yeah, there you go. But second, DKG raised something earlier, which I don't think we quite ran to ground, which was making this work for people who do not have, is that in there? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we're good. I should make sure we capture that. I have no idea how to do that. Just to be clear, none. There are things I have some idea. This one I got none.
Uh, I suggested the consultation and engagement. I do think it will help with evidence, but I do not think it should be just a. I don't think that's the only reason we're doing it, and I don't think consulting with them at the end of the process is the right approach.
Are you saying you want the conversations to happen throughout the working group's life cycle, not just at the end?
This is number 3, not a new thing.
Yes. And I think it's throughout the process, but also like the goal is not just to give evidence. Yeah, 6 looks fine with me.
Okay, thanks. Maggie.
Yeah, I was about to say basically the same thing Nick said about the second half. For 6, what do people think liaise means? I think what I would say is really important is that it's an iterative process, that there's many conversations rather than a here's the thing, can you react to the thing, but it's more of a conversation, co-creation.
Is work with a better engage?
I think work with is better, yeah.
Yeah, that's better too, because liaison has our specific meaning in the IETF. Andrew.
I just also on that point, if we work with intimate partner violence experts, for example, just in the US, they may have a very different perspective than those in the global south.
Yeah, we're a global organization, so we'll work with people globally. I don't think we need to say that really. It's kind of implicit. Yeah. Stephen.
Right. So I was kind of happier with 3 before you split it into 2 parts, because I think what that loses is, the idea of does it actually work? Because I think what's written here is we just have to write some code, and then we got to liaise or talk to people, and then we can declare we're done. I don't necessarily think that's good enough. Maybe I'm, in the rough here, or just the only voice saying that, but that's what I think.
I mean, I think we could have it in both places. I don't really see a problem with having the general, there's always the general text at the end of a charter that says who you're going to work with. So I think we can add it there, but we could also add back the more specific language in 3.
I think that would be better, because the idea is basically we want to get some evaluation that, yeah, it's actually worth doing this. And I think that's kind of lost a bit by just doing this. And adding that back would be perfectly fine by me.
And I think we should add a 7 that says 2 years out.
Milestones before. Okay. Chad.
I'm Chad Sniffen with the National Network to End Domestic Violence in the United States. And so I would recommend changing intimate partner violence to gender-based violence. That's not a distinction that is probably meaningful to IETF, but actually in our field, there is a distinction between intimate partner violence and gender-based violence. And stalking and tracking really is it matters across different types of abuse.
And just a clarifying question, gender-based violence is more of an umbrella term and better?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. I think we should do the BOF questions. Yeah. So I think we'll work on text for these, but we can move to the BOF questions.
All right, so it's time to do some BOF questions. Are we going to use the tool, or are we just going to hum the old way, old-fashioned way? We got to get the tool. Oh, tool. Sorry. All right, so usually what we do at this point is we ask a bunch of questions to try to get a sense of the room and the participants that are remote to be able to answer these questions, to figure out whether the IETF is interested in doing this work. Roman?
I just wanted to remind everyone, since we're polling as Sean is talking, please log in if you have not logged into the MeetEcho client, so you can.
It will also ensure, if we become a working group, that we have a room that's appropriately sized, and you will not be sitting on top of each other. All right, I'll give everybody like 20 seconds to do that, and then we'll read the question off. Alyssa, are you typing? There are 2 choices. It's yes and no. And yes, it's one question for all 4 of these. So here you go. If you think the problem statement is clear, well scoped, solvable, and useful to solve, choose yes. If not, pick no. Thank you. All right, well, we had 171 people in the room. We got about, there's like 10 more seconds and then I'm going to close it. So those that are sitting on the fence. All right, that little last bit. All right, let's close it out. And the tool will spit back the answer. I believe it will. What? They can't see it. All right.
You can see it in online.
All right. Oh yeah, here it is. So just for the notes, we had 82 yeses and 16 nos and 73 no responses. All right, Bob. Is there anybody that said no that would like to get to the microphone to explain why? All right, going on to BOF question number 2. Who would be willing to contribute drafts and review drafts, and who is interested in implementing? I mean, no. So I mean, I think the first one we should do separate. We should do each one of these separately. For contribute drafts, review drafts, and then who's implementing is just a raise of hands. I'd love to implement, but you know, nobody wants my thing. All right, so this is the first one. And who would be willing to contribute drafts? It's all right. Well, okay, good. Well, the fact that we have 18 people that are willing to contribute, I think, is showing is in the right direction. And so that's, I think we'll close that one out. We'll do the next one for who's willing to review drafts, which I think is probably the little more important one. Because again, it's for chairs, it's good to have an active working group and people respond to things on list in the GitHub repos, et cetera. So this is, if you'd be willing to review the drafts, please choose yes. All right, so we're clearly in the 60s for yes, which is fun working group. All right, and so is there anybody beyond the 4 people, the 4 companies, the Apple, Google, Samsung, and Tile, that have already said that they would be interested, that this is that they want to join in, and they'd be willing to raise their hand and say their names just out of curiosity? And we are not holding your feet to the fire, and you know, press releases will not be made by me. Nalini, I see Nalini's hand up in the air. Okay. Pebblebee was the 3rd. Okay. Yes, so they're supportive.
Chipolo is also raising hand for implementation in the chat.
Yeah, so I think in the original press release where I think it was Samsung Tile and Pebblebee, if I got that right, they said they were supportive of the effort. There was no claim that they would necessarily implement it, though.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, got it. Nalini?
Nalini. I just wanted to say we've already started working on the implementation and going through the drafts and found a few things that we have questions about. So we have, it's a group of, it's a university in India, and it's super interesting actually testing this in India rather than here in terms of the networks and the prevalence. So we'll be throwing some stuff out as we get it.
Yep, great. All right, so BOF question number 3, is there support to form a working group with the proposed charter? And again, this is going to include the bullets that we talked about, mashing it in to the suggestions. Roman?
And again, since there's lots of new participants, let's clarify that. It's assuming that the charter changes that were thrown up are kind of made, and then we will nevertheless return with the final version of that to the mailing list, and we will again check kind of consensus.
All right, well, that seems to be pretty overwhelming. I guess this is another one. Are there any no's that would be willing that would like to get to the microphone to say no? All right, so we'll close it. We're at 72 yeses and I think 2 no's. Would any of the no's like to get to the microphone to explain why? All right. The next one is the one. It's basically the same question again. Is there anyone that feels that a working group should not be formed? We're not really going to do a poll for that. We did have one. We did have one last time. So to be completely transparent, right? The last time we did this, we had one no. But there are none today. So I think we're done 20 minutes early. Let's all go to the bar. Take 1 second, Roman.
Well, hello, everyone. So first, I just want to kind of thank you, everyone. We had a huge kind of turnout here. I mean, 171 kind of participants is a really nice showing for a BOF, and I want to thank everyone for a constructive conversation on a very important kind of topic. And I'm glad to see lots of stakeholders that sometimes don't participate here are coming to help us talk about this important kind of topic. This is our kind of second BOF, and we've seen really significant kind of motion in refining the charter text around this feedback. We have a much broader scope that we opened with, which is nice. And what I see here is kind of tangible next steps, and let's kind of talk through all of that. I mean, it appears that we have strong consensus to move forward with the working group, but to repeat that process I had before Sean threw up the last question, there is that list of 6 items that need to be merged into the current text that we've been talking about. That's going to be kind of merged in the coming weeks. We're then going to return back to the mailing list, holding the consensus we had in our hand that we're heading in the direction of forming a working group. That new text will be added to that draft, and then we will check for consensus again on the mailing list before we proceed. And should that consensus be found, then it will go to the ISG for consideration. So just to kind of level set that process. Again, kind of thank you for kind of all of this feedback. And this is an important topic to be working in. So thanks so much, everyone. Have a nice day.
What's up, man? Alles gut. Alles gut. You go. Who? What? SML is next.